The University of Georgia, from Sinkwich to Walker, a school with a proud football tradition. The University of Florida, shining on the gridiron behind stars like Steve Spurrier and Emmitt Smith. The two schools, arch rivals since 1904.
I mean, it's pure, absolute, total war when you hit that field.
It's a big one, it always has been, and I think it's probably the biggest rivalry we have since we're both in the Southeastern Conference and the Eastern Division.
This is something that people will remember for a lifetime, and hopefully in the future it'll be the same way.
If you can't get up to play, you'll never get up to play. This is it.
For more than 60 years, the best party in college football was thrown each year in Jacksonville, Florida. Fans of the University of Florida, fans of the University of Georgia, a neutral site that adds to the uniqueness of this special event.
A tremendously big event, even if you didn't play the game. I mean, everything around it is just so big and so exciting, and parties all week long, and then when you have 40,000 people in red and black and 40,000 people in orange and blue, there's just nothing like it.
For the players, nothing is like the bus ride that takes them into the stadium on the morning of the big game.
There's no greater feeling that I've experienced in college athletics, or not many. When you cross the St. Johns River and you're going to the Gator Bowl, and you see the people 4, 5, and 10 deep, and Georgia, Florida people side by side, and when you get off the bus and they make a line for you, it's probably 20 deep. There's not many things that give you that feeling.
With all the people in the stands and usually national television and the fans lining the sidewalk, our players, several of them have said to me, said, "Coach, we knew this was different. There was something different about this game when we were taking that bus ride into the stadium."
The bus ride signals the start of each year's game. But when did the series get its start? In this rivalry, even that is disputed. In 1899, the Florida Agricultural and Mechanical College played its first football game. 5 years later, the school became known as the University of Florida, and it was then that, according to the Macon News and the University of Georgia, that the two teams played their first game. Georgia was the convincing winner, piling up 52 points. Perhaps as a result of the rule early in the century that the team that scored got the ball back to try for the end zone again.
With a rush, the Giants of Georgia went down the field this afternoon against the Little Men of Florida, dug dirt 9 times beyond the touchdown line, cut through the air of the goalpost 7 times, and all the while the laddies from the land of flowers drank the dust of defeat to the tune of nothing, nothing, nothing doing. The Atlanta Constitution, 1904.
The two teams would not meet again until 1915, and it's this game then that Florida recognizes as the start of the series. The schools agreed to play the game at a neutral site, Jacksonville, Florida, and a tradition was born. Although 11 years had passed, Georgia again was too good for Florida, who since 1904 had a new home, Gainesville, and a new nickname, the Gators. David Paddock was the Georgia Cracker star in front of the Jacksonville crowd. Georgia won 37-0. In 1920, Georgia changed its nickname from Wildcats to Bulldogs and made it 5 straight wins against their Florida rivals. Georgia finished that year as one of 9 unbeaten teams in the land. The series took a 5-year hiatus. In 1926, it was back. In 26, Georgia was a winner, 32-9. In 27, Georgia was a winner, 28-0. One of the school's all-time best running backs, Curtis McCrary, had a memorable game, scoring 3 touchdowns. Georgia had won the first 7 games in convincing style, outscoring the Florida 11 by the combined score of 249-9. It wasn't until the next year when Florida got its due. Gator fans had waited for November 11th, 1928 for a long time. This was the strongest Gator team in school history, led by the pass receiving of Dale Van Sickle. Van Sickle caught a touchdown pass in the Georgia game, and Florida's defense was strong and sturdy as the Gators claimed their first win in the series, 26-6. Early in the series, the game was moved around. Jacksonville's Fairfield Stadium, Athens' Sanford Stadium, Savannah's Municipal Stadium, and Gainesville's Florida Field. But in 1933, the series settled down. Although the city didn't know it then, Jacksonville became the permanent home for the series. It's been an event that has characterized this city for the next 60 years. For one weekend each year, fans from both schools converge on this northern Florida city. They fill the hotels, they eat at the restaurants, they spend their money. It's one of college football's greatest parties, and 82,000 people get an invite. Some even call it the world's greatest outdoor cocktail party.
Bill Castells, who was the sports editor of the Florida Times-Union for many years, gave it that name. And at first, some of the school officials didn't like it. They thought it was demeaning and unacademic and all those kind of things. But it's a pretty good name for it.
Before the game coming in, this guy, one year I remember this guy had this big, long overcoat. And he held his coat up like that, and he must have had, he had about 5 or 6 bottles of liquor, little special pockets made, and he did this, and he had all this liquor. It truly was a tremendous cocktail party.
The enthusiasm from the fans has always been there. Even back in '33, in the midst of the recession, Jacksonville showed no signs of decline. Nor did Georgia. Riding the momentum set by their star players, Georgia won the next 3 games in the series. Cy Grant scored 2 touchdowns in 1933. John Bond ran and threw for a touchdown in 1934. And Al Minot ran for a late 18-yard score as Georgia won again in 1935. Heading into 1937, Georgia had won 13 of the first 16 meetings. But the Bulldogs lost to Florida in '37 and lost their fine coach, Harry Mayer, at the end of the season. In 10 years, Mayer beat rival Florida 6 times. Mayer would be replaced by Sam Hunt on the Georgia sidelines, who would be replaced by Wallace Butts the very next year. The Little Round Man, as Butts was affectionately called, debuted with a win in '39. An impressive foursome of ball carriers, Vasa Kate, Robert Sainsbury, Jimmy Fordham, and Billy Mims scored 24 of the 25 Georgia points over the last 2 years of the decade.
They really play 2 games when Florida and Georgia meet at Jacksonville. Spectators play one all night long. They're still up by the dawn's early light. There's no thought of sleep, and fortified by a little libation and a spot of food, if there's time, they go gaily to Municipal Stadium and see if they had figured things out right. Traveling men making their regular visits on game eve don't have a chance. They can't get taxis, hotel service, or anything else. The town is turned over to football. The Atlanta Constitution, November 11th, 1939.
The 30s belonged to the red and black from Athens. And as the 40s started, there seemed no reason why things would be different. In the early 40s, you see, Georgia had the horses, the big-time stars, some of the best players in the country. First, Frank Sinkwich. Fireball Frankie, a headliner who could run like the wind, burned Florida for 142 yards in 1941 and 4 touchdowns in 1942. Sinkwich won the Heisman Trophy his senior year. The '42 game will always be remembered. No last-second field goal or legendary plays, just an old-fashioned blowout. Georgia 75, Florida nothing. Gene Ellenson played on the winning side that day.
Georgia kicked off to Florida. Florida ran 2 plays, 2 running plays, threw a pass. Bill Godwin, our linebacker, center, once wrote a book called Cotton Pickin' Linebacker. Intercepted the pass. was tackled immediately, and the first play, Sinkwich ran off tackle 28 yards for a touchdown. Georgia kicked off Florida again in the exact same script. Florida ran 2 plays, threw a pass, Bill Godwin intercepted, was tackled immediately, and Sinkwich ran the same play off tackle and scored a touchdown again. At the end of the first quarter, it was 28-0.
Ellenson knows this rivalry better than anyone. He may have played for Georgia, but for the last 35 years has worked for the University of Florida.
I wasn't going to bring that up, but since you did, it's been very embarrassing for me as a Gator Booster executive director to live with the fact that I played on that team that most embarrassed the University of Florida. And I never mention it, but it does come up occasionally.
Gene had a lot to root for on the Georgia side in the years after he left school. In the mid-40s, the Bulldogs continued their domination with wins against Florida in 1944, 1945, and 1946. For 3 years, Florida couldn't stop Georgia's Charlie Trippi. In 1945, Triple Threat Trippi scored 3 touchdowns, and in 1946, he finished 7 of 7 passing. Why triple threat? In the 46 Florida game, Charlie had 1 touchdown passing, 1 touchdown rushing, and 1 touchdown receiving. As the game hit its silver anniversary, Georgia had won 20 meetings and had outscored Florida 618-140. The familiar pattern continued over the next 2 years, but then in 1949, Florida had a breakthrough.
The Gators had a pretty good running back named Chuck Hunsinger. He was a brilliant hurdler. He ran the high hurdles out of Harrisburg, Illinois, and had just great speed. And he'd had some good games against Alabama, and I was out at the field practicing with the team practicing, and Chuck's biggest buddy was a big tackle named Frank Dempsey, who later played for the Bears. And I said, guys, we got to beat Georgia. It's been 8 years, the whole war's, the world's turned upside down since we beat them the last time. And Chuck said, what would you suggest? Well, I said, I know you and Frank like to hunt. And I said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. If you guys, especially you, Hunsinger, if you can get 2 touchdowns, we'll win the ball game, and I'll see if I can't get you one of my bird dogs. So Hunsinger had a fantastic afternoon in 48, scored 3 touchdowns, not 2. And then I was saddled with the job of getting him a bird dog, which I did. And Chuck called him Blocker, and he and Dempsey used to hunt the dog.
If you're a Florida fan, Hunsinger's performance was simply glorious. 174 yards rushing, 3 touchdowns, and a song. Zip Newman of the Birmingham News wrote a tune entitled The Hunsinger Song. No player is torrider than this lad from Florida, he penned. Hunsinger, the Hundinger, you ought to see him go. Hunsinger's performance and the hiring of new coach Bob Woodruff gave Florida fans new hope of making the series more competitive.
Well, Bob Woodruff came to Florida, and he also brought Ray Graves down there with him. Together, they began to start the intense rivalry on the field, where Florida, generally speaking, was about as good as Georgia. In other words, it was about an even match.
In 1951, in just his 2nd year at Georgia, quarterback Zeke Bratkowski played with the savvy of a senior. Z and Z. That's all it took for Georgia on that day in '51. Zeke and Zippy. Morocco, that is. Little Zippy caught the game winner.
It was 4th down, and we went for it. And the play called for one of the ends in the end zone to throw, try to get it into the end zone. Well, they were covered, and I ran a flare route from my halfback position, and I was kind of the safety valve. And Zeke Bratkowski was our quarterback, and he threw it to me, on the run, and I faked a couple of guys out and went in and scored.
While the Bulldogs won 20 of the first 25 games, Florida began to turn things around in the early 50s, starting with a 30-0 blowout win in 1952. In fact, beginning with the 1953 Florida victory, the Bulldogs and Gators split the next 40 meetings. Doug Dickey was a member of that '53 squad.
Florida-Georgia rivalry to me started when I was a player. Certainly it was one of the big games on the Florida schedule. In the early 50s, it was probably the most dominant competition along with Miami. The Georgia game had more close friends maybe involved in it, the cross ties of the two states. But I think that I felt that this game had a special place because of the neutral site in Jacksonville.
That 53 game became a major stepping stone for the series. For the first time, the game was televised nationally on NBC. It would be the start of an incredible run of games that hit the airwaves coast to coast. And the country had an eye on the Gators, playing their best football in the history of the series. Oh, sure, there was a 1-point setback in 54 on a blocked conversion attempt, but things were otherwise perfect. Take away the block, and Florida would have found themselves riding a 7-game winning streak. Bob Woodruff had done his job.
I know that Florida was down by a score of 13-0 in 1955 in Woodruff's day. Coach Woodruff was a head coach, and he had a pretty good football team, but he was still building. The Gators didn't have anything like they have today. And he had a young fellow named Dickie Allen, who was a kind of a maligned quarterback. Dickie had some tough times, and he had to have a good day, and he had a good day against Georgia that day. But halftime score 13-0, and the Gators come back, and Jim Roundtree gets the opening kickoff and runs it back 85 yards for a touchdown. Florida picks up another touchdown. It's tied up at 13-13 going into the fourth quarter. And Allen, who was had been shifted over to playing safety rather than playing quarterback, picked off a Georgia pass at the Gator 48-yard line. And Dickie Allen ran all over that Gator Bowl field. And finally, just as he's about to run out of gas, he staggered into the end zone for a touchdown and won the ball game 19-13, which was a great comeback.
3 years later, Florida completed a 4-game series streak.
Well, the game I really remember it probably as vividly as if it just happened last week was the 1958 Florida-Georgia game in Jacksonville, which was just an incredible football game to only have 7 points scored by us and 6 by Georgia. Georgia dominated the football game. They had a good team. They had Fran Tarkenton at quarterback, and they had 11 first downs in the first half. We didn't have any, and there was no score. It was nothing. What would happen is Georgia would drive the ball the length of the field, and somehow they'd lose a fumble. We'd make a great defensive stand. They'd miss a field goal, and then Bobby Joe Green, our great punter, would punt them clear down to the other end of the field. He had an 82-yard punt in that game, which is the longest in school history. He averaged over 50 yards a kick. Bobby Joe would kick them the other end of the field, and here they'd come again. They'd march down to our end. They couldn't score.
And the yardage was something like 350 to 150 that day, and the first downs were something like 18-5 in favor of Georgia. But in the fourth quarter, Jimmy Dunn, I never remember making a run anything like it. He ran a little option to the left and he was a 5'10", 140-pound quarterback. And he broke through a little gap there and got in the open and took off, and nobody caught him. He ran about 78 yards.
Quarterback Fran Tarkenton tried to bring Georgia back, but in the end, the Bulldogs fell short. The next year, Georgia did win a muddy game at the Gator Bowl. Charlie Britt came up with this interception and raced 100 yards, the longest interception return in series history. Britt was the star of the game, throwing a touchdown as well. Florida was the series leader of the 50s, but with a new decade approaching, there were plenty of questions in Gainesville as Woodruff resigned and Ray Graves was set to take over. Could Graves keep up the recent success?
For me personally, it was really one of the big ball games. I've said many times that coaching at Florida, if you lost to Georgia and FSU and Miami, you could win the conference championship and still get fired. But it's really a second homecoming for both teams, and it certainly didn't take me long to realize what it meant to the Florida fans and to me too as a coach of the Gators.
That first year was a success for Graves, as the Gators raced out to a 22-0 lead, then held on despite a furious Bulldog comeback, defeating Georgia 22-14. That 1960 game was the last in the series for Wally Butts, who resigned as Georgia coach to become athletic director, leaving behind an overall winning percentage of 64%. The next 3 years were frustrating for Bulldog fans and new head coach Johnny Griffith, who lost all 3 battles with Florida, mostly because of Larry Dupree. As a sophomore in 1962, Dupree registered 2 touchdowns and 111 yards. In '63, Dupree again was the star, scoring a touchdown in a 21-14 win. 1964. A former Auburn quarterback, Vince Dooley, came in to try to resurrect a floundering Georgia program. At just 32 years old, this was some assignment. The cure for an ailing program? Beat arch rival Florida.
For our people, for the most part, it was a trip that they look forward to. We've said many times that I always enjoyed practicing here in Athens because there were no distractions. Because all of the townspeople and a lot of the students would leave on Tuesday or Wednesday. And they would all go down for a long, fun weekend where they would stay either at Sea Island or St. Simon's or Amelia Island, some of those great resorts down there. And there was a tradition. Many, many people would meet down there, have a long weekend together, play golf, and then, of course, it all is brought together and climaxed by the football game.
It's a road trip, all right, but the Georgia people take those islands and they use them for golf and tennis and beach walking and drinking, and the lucky ones leave usually Tuesday morning for the Saturday game, and the average guy probably tries to sneak out on Thursday. But there's an awful lot of golf, and there's an awful lot of fishing and tennis and stuff going on all week. They jam those islands. They've got every condo and everything rented that there is.
Coming into the '64 clash, the Bulldogs were enjoying an unexpectedly fine season. The game, Dooley's first in the series, would become a classic. Bobby Etter was called on to attempt a go-ahead field goal with 9 minutes to go and the score tied. The snap was wild, but Etter, showing great presence of mind, scooped up the ball and ran toward the end zone. Dooley had a win in his coaching debut in the series, and Ray Graves' 4-game winning streak was snapped.
I was afraid you were going to ask that one. That's what it was. James Barry, the Scott poet, said, God gave us memories so we could have roses in December, but there's a few thorns on those roses too, and that was certainly a thorn.
That 1964 game also marked the debut of another influential figure in the history of the series. At quarterback for Florida was Steve Spurrier, who in his 3 years developed into one of college football's greatest quarterbacks of all time. What many don't remember is that Spurrier almost lost all 3 games he played against Georgia, as in 1965, the Bulldogs held a fourth quarter 10-7 lead. Then late in the game, Spurrier pulled off a classic drive, taking over the ball 78 yards away from the winning score. On the first play, Spurrier found all-conference receiver Charlie Casey for 46 yards.
On the next play, Jack Harper went out of the backfield and went into the end zone, and Spurrier dropped back, and Spurrier threw it, and Harper was right between 2 defenders, and one of them appeared to stumble, and the other one didn't quite get there, and Harper caught it in the end zone, and Florida wins 14-10.
The next year, the Spurrier hype was on. The Heisman Trophy candidate was truly having a spectacular season when Florida met Georgia. But as often happens in this series, the underdogs came through. Georgia quarterback Kirby Moore scored a touchdown to lead the Bulldogs to a win over Spurrier's Gators.
We had the defensive players to put the proper pressure on the quarterback. We had a player by the name of Bill Stanfill that went on and became all-pro and led the professional football in sacks, and he had quite a few sacks that day on Steve Spurrier.
Bill Stanfill was an all-conference and all-American tackle at Georgia, and he had been in bed with the flu all week, and they didn't think he would play. And of course, that was certainly something that we wished him good health, but we didn't care if he didn't get a chance to play. But he played, and he sacked Coach Steve Spurrier, now Coach Spurrier, about 4 or 5 times, and forced a fumble that resulted in a touchdown. And I said, after the game, I said, well, I'm glad that Stanfield wasn't feeling too well and was under the weather, but I said if he had been healthy, he might have killed Steve and had put him in prison. But it was a great game that he played, and he led a real defense that was the difference in that ball game.
One thing about this series, there have been some beautiful plays. And in 1967, one of the best ever. Watch Richard Trapp, a talented Florida wide receiver, who after he makes the catch, makes the run of a lifetime. This play helped the Gators to a win in '67. Just one of so many spectacular plays, with plenty more to come.
That's one of those really highlights. You have to see it to believe it. I think 6 players missed him, and that was a good Georgia defensive football team too. But Richard Trapp was, and he made another run almost for a touchdown, which set up a field goal. So he was a hero of that game, and I have a picture in my Hall of Fame of him making on that memorable run that he made against Georgia, and then of course went on to beat them 17-16. That was really a great, exciting football game for the fans, both Georgia and Florida, but Florida prevailed thanks to Richard Trapp.
Another dazzler came the very next year, 1968, a game highlighted by this punt return. Jake Scott, who later went on to star with the Miami Dolphins, came up with this 59-yard punt return, and Georgia was off to a blowout win. In a driving rain, Georgia scored again and again and again.
It rained the whole time, poured down rain. The water was standing on the sidelines. It was one of those things, if you got tackled and went all the way to the fence, you were worried about drowning if somebody was on top of you. I mean, that's how high the water was.
When it was over, the scoreboard read, Georgia 51, Florida nothing. The blowout just made Florida hungry for revenge. They hoped to cross the bridge to a victory in 1969 against their arch rival. Jacksonville's Gator Bowl would play host to the game for the 22nd time. Led by a school of sophomores, Florida had been opening eyes during the season with their offensive performances, and they alarmed Georgia in the '69 game with an early touchdown to lead 7-0, and then a field goal to jump ahead 10-0 at the half. Georgia stormed back, scoring twice in the second half. The go-ahead touchdown, a long dash by Travis Payne of 46 yards. Florida would come back. Richard Franco drilled a 21-yard field goal to tie things up at 13. And then after getting the ball back and being led into scoring position by sophomore quarterback John Reeves, a bad snap foiled Franco's chances to be a hero. For the first time in 39 years, Florida and Georgia walked off the field dead even after 48 minutes. The game also marked the departure of Ray Graves, who at 6-3-1 against Georgia will go down as one of the most successful Florida coaches in series history. In 1970, Florida had a new coach, Doug Dickey, and the John Reeves to Carlos Alvarez connection had become the hottest thing in Florida since the Orange.
Florida football at that point, we were kind of struggling. We were making a changeover from the Ray Graves era to the Doug Dickey era, and we'd had some ups and some downs, and probably more downs than ups at that point. One of the great passing combinations in our history was John Reeves to Carlos Alvarez.
The two players would become instrumental in determining the outcome of this edition of the Border War, but not before the game turned on a miscue.
I'm the tight end on the right side, and I had to block Jack Youngblood that day. The guy was about 250, 6'6", and I'm about 6'2", 200. And he killed me all day. I don't think I blocked him any all day. Why they call the play to that side, but they call the play to the right side. Jack Youngblood just pushes me out of the way, stripped the ball out of Ricky Lake's hands, so they got the ball on like the 2 or 3 yard line. Controversial, I think that Ricky Lake was down when the ball was taken away from him. I think if you look at the reruns, I'm sure they'll show that, as a matter of fact.
That's when Reeves and Alvarez took over. A 32-yard hookup tied the score at 17-17. Would the game end in a tie for the second straight year? Not if Reeves and Alvarez got the ball back.
I sprinted out to the left and then, did a throwback action, plant your foot and turn your body and threw the post back to him, and we hit him in through the seam there between the corner and the safety, and he split them and took it in.
This 48-yard hookup won the game for Florida. Truly one of the great games of the series. After a one-sided win by Georgia in 1971, a game in which Ricky Lake redeemed himself and scored twice, the Bulldogs and the Gators played another classic in 1972. Georgia tied the game on this pass play from Andy Johnson to Rex Putnall and set the stage for a classic finish.
Again, one of those tight contests, 7-7. We didn't know how it was going to all come out, but finally our defensive tackle, Spivey, caused a fumble on the Florida back. We got the ball.
And now we're thinking, all right, we got a chance to go down and score now, because it's been a defensive battle back and forth all day. And when we got the fumble, I was just saying, man, we've got to score. We're going to win this game. And I'm just thinking, boy, if it comes down to a field goal in the Georgia-Florida game with 80 and 90,000 people, it was, so my knees were shaking.
We got the ball, couldn't move it. And then we sent in little Kim Braswell, a left-footer, who incidentally had a hearing aid. And he would always turn down his hearing aid when he would go in to kick. And that's when I called on him and I saw him reach over, turn down his hearing aid because he could hear nothing.
So I ran out on the field and Coach Dooley called timeout. And I said, oh my God, he called timeout. That's something Florida would do. I thought that was going to be suicide. But anyway, he called a timeout and then Florida called a timeout. And I'm just thinking, somebody let me kick the football. I want to get this over with. You know, you go in the doctor's office and you're sitting there with a big horse needle. You gonna stick me or don't, you know? Let me do something. But anyway, Roy Smith and Andy Johnson, all of them came up and said, hey, little man, just keep your head down, kick the football.
With the game in the balance, Braswell calmly won the game for the Bulldogs and solidified his place in series history.
It was probably the best feeling when I kicked it and looked up and that thing was sailing to the middle of the upright. And even 22 years later, it gives me chills to think about it.
In the next 3 years, only 6 points would separate the two teams as the Doug Dickey era continued at Florida. In 1973, Don Gaffney was Florida's signal caller and found his team trailing 10-3 late in the game.
Don Gaffney dropped back and threw across the goal line, and 2 men were on McGriff's back. One of them was on one shoulder and one other just draped over this little fella. And as he was going down, the ball right in his hands, he caught it just inches off the ground and pulled it to his breast and made it 10-9.
One of the amazing things, if you look back on the film, is Don getting the throw off, everybody doing what they had to do, but Burton Lawless, who was a guard, was set up the block looking for a blitz. The linebacker doesn't come, and of course he was taught, you look for the linebacker. If he doesn't come, then check somewhere else to see if you can help. And I am telling you, within just a whisker, he turned and saw a blitzing outside Georgia player and just picked him off within inches of putting his hands on Don Gaffney and sacking him, and he would have never gotten the ball off. So talk about a game of inches. That play, from all different angles, was a play of inches that gave us a chance to win.
The 2-point play we threw to Hank Folberg, our tight end, and I think he'd only caught like 3 passes all year. I mean, he was not a receiver. But he was wide open in the end zone and managed to hold on to the ball. In fact, Gaffney threw it so hard it almost drilled a hole in his stomach. And Hank said afterward, he said, there's no way I could have dropped it. It just stuck in my stomach.
I don't know why I was fortunate enough to have been able to play that role. There's lots of great players that didn't have that moment in the sun in that game. And I certainly look back and have had some special plays and memories in Florida football, but to be able to be a person that got to experience that, that's just a gift.
Incredibly, the very next year, a last-second 2-point conversion failed for Florida as Gaffney's pass fell incomplete, and Georgia had sweet revenge, 17-16. In 1975, Irk Russell, Georgia's defensive coordinator, labeled his unit as the Junkyard Dogs, and the Bulldogs' defense was the talk of the nation.
I think our defense had played so well
They just kept fighting, and Florida never got ahead. But it was hard for us to do any good with the Florida defense, which was so powerful in that particular year. So having a special play really accommodated that situation.
Two of the assistant coaches took me in a coffee shop, and they took a napkin. First, they diagrammed the things I had to watch for, what Florida was going to do to us that day. And we were drinking coffee just frantically. We were also having smoking contests. Coach Irk Russell and I had a cigar contest, and the other coach, Bill Pace, smoked cigarettes just like a chain. I mean, just puffing them out, you know. All of a sudden, as they were leaving, and they did this a lot for me in Jacksonville as I caught up to the team, but on this particular day, Pace said, we better show them what we're going to do. Irk said, okay. And I took another napkin, and they drew a play they were going to try that day if they needed it. Georgia had a tight end who had been a quarterback 4 or 5 years ago in high school. They didn't think that Florida remembered that. And they were going to run an end-around reverse with this tight end, bring him back out around the backfield, and let him stop and throw a long pass.
And Appleby came around and took a handoff from the quarterback about 6 yards deep in the backfield, running toward the offensive right. In the meantime, Gene Washington, who at that time was the fastest back we'd ever had at Georgia, he ran about a 4.340, or what's equivalent to about a 9.300 yard dash. Washington was entirely in the open downfield, nobody within 8 or 10 yards of him.
My thought at the time was, oh, we scored too early because there was too much time left on the clock, which is exactly what happened. Florida came all the way back down the field, inside our 20-yard line, before we were able to cause a fumble and recover the fumble to actually win the game.
Appleby to Washington. That's all you need to say. Georgia had won again. The following year, both Florida and Georgia came into their annual tussle ranked in the top 10. It was the first time in series history that both teams had been ranked so high, and the nation watched the game on ABC TV.
It was a big game for us. We were in the hunt, had an opportunity to win the conference championship, and obviously we had to beat Florida to do that. And it was a great experience. Of course, the Georgia-Florida game always has been.
The first half in 1976 belonged to Florida. Boy, did it ever. Defensively, the Gators seemed to be a step ahead. Offensively, Jimmy Fisher, Wes Chandler, Earl Carr were all standouts. The Bulldogs didn't know where to turn. When the first 24 minutes had come to a close, Florida had scored 27 points. The wishbone was working to the tune of 243 yards. Georgia looked like they were in real trouble.
I remember very vividly being in the locker room at halftime and the players kind of celebrating a little bit. And I remember feeling deep down inside, boy, I hope this is not premature. I hope these guys aren't really celebrating too early.
Well, we were down by 14 points, and I think everyone that was in that locker room will always remember that halftime speech from every coach as well as Coach Dooley. And we were definitely ready to play football the second half.
I'm just going off recollection from 20-something years, almost 20 years ago, and I believe we kicked off to them and we had stopped them. And that was when Coach Dickey went for what the Florida Times-Union labeled the 4th and dumb play, which his feelings were that Georgia had taken control of the football game, and and they were moving, and we had not had success. And I can remember Johnny Henderson making a big play on their running back out in the flats on the option play. And it's one of those plays that's etched in your mind for eternity.
After the Florida blunder, Ray Goff took over the game. 2 passing touchdowns, 3 rushing touchdowns. When it was over, the Bulldogs had won 41-27.
It was, and I think that really is perhaps the signature game in Vince's career in many ways, meaning that it doesn't matter how far behind you get, you can, with great offensive line play, do a flip-flop. In other words, this is proof that you don't have to throw the football to come from behind, because we did not throw it during Ray's years as quarterback running the veer, because he could run the veer so well. He could dominate the game.
2 years later, one Bulldogs player recalls some unusual pregame preparations.
Probably shouldn't say this, but I guess it's okay now. On Thursday night, seniors, we always had a little get-together, and we were at our usual place for conversation after dinner, and we had gotten a report that the weather was going to be about 65 degrees for a high, and it was going to be a cool afternoon. And so we had a good Thursday night party. And so we get to Jacksonville, and it's about 85 degrees, and it's hot and it's steamy. The first series of downs, we were 3 plays and out, and Coach Casey came over there to the offensive line, and he advised Jim Milo and myself, as well as Mark Hodge, and who was sitting there, that he saw us Thursday night, and if he did not want us reported to Coach Dooley, we better win the ball game. And so that was our biggest motivator that year.
Another motivator was the fact that for the Bulldogs, the SEC championship was on the line, and a huge, enthusiastic crowd was on hand.
It was one of those typical kind of Florida games. You know, it was kind of hot and muggy. It rained the night before. Steam was coming off the ground, and fans were just going wild, just absolutely out of their mind. You know, you could hear the beer bottles popping, and that was back when they just let you take coolers into the stadium. So it was just one big party watching this football game.
The game turned out to be an exciting one. Willie McClendon, playing with a hairline fracture of the wrist, scored first for Georgia. They led 7-3. Later, thoughts harkened back to Appleby in Washington when Amp Arnold took an end around and fired long for a Bulldog score. Georgia had extended their lead to 14, but Florida came back. After 2 touchdowns, the Gators found themselves in a position to tie the game with this 2-point conversion. But Steve Dennis deflected the John Brantley pass, and Chris Walton came up with the interception.
That put us in position to go to Auburn and play for the SEC championship. So that's kind of what that game means. It gives you a position to jump from that game to the Auburn game and hopefully have an opportunity to win it all.
That 1978 game would be the last for Doug Dickey in the series. No matter which side of this rivalry you pull for, the 1980 game can never be forgotten. Georgia was undefeated, ranked 2nd in the nation. Florida ranked 20th in the country and hoping for the upset. Freshman Herschel Walker gets the Bulldogs on the board with this 72-yard run. But behind the receiving of Tyrone Young, Florida storms back. Young had never caught a pass before the game. He caught 10 on the day. When James Jones scored, Florida trailed by 4. When Young caught this pass on a 2-point conversion, Florida trailed by a deuce. Later, Florida took the lead on a field goal. Then, with just 95 seconds to go, Georgia got the ball at its own 7. On first down, quarterback Buck Ballou fumbled the football out of bounds, a 1-yard loss. On second down, Ballou again rolled to his right, but again came up empty. It's 3rd down and 11.
It was one of those games that you were white-knuckled the whole time, you know, just sitting there watching this game, and we were holding on to this game, and it looked like we had them backed up. Buck Ballou hadn't hit the side of a barn almost all day long, and it was 3rd and distance, and we said, we've got him.
Our team had developed during the course of the year a feeling that somehow they were going to win football games. They'd already done it 2 or 3 times earlier, so despite how bleak it looked at the time, we were back on the 7 or 8 yard line. It was 3rd down and 12 or 14. And I think that Florida, on the other hand, it was such a great opportunity for an upset that they might have begun celebrating just a little bit too early.
We had the dig pass play called, which everybody in the country runs. Lindsey Scott, our ex-receiver, split in, so to speak, on an 18-yard crossing route. So we had the right play call versus that defense, and I knew if I had a little bit of time that the chances are we were going to get a first down.
Well, the films will show it clearly, though you only see probably half of his body. But you see Ballou as he's raising his arm, he would have been yanked down from behind by the Florida lineman. But you see number 65 come and nudge him with his shoulder, just enough. And what used to be a block in football, and now they've changed the rules and say you can put your hands out and push somebody, which is really not a block, but they say it is now in football. But he had to block him the old-fashioned way, and he did. He banged him with his shoulder, got him off stride, and Buck threw the ball.
Stand up fire, they may or may not blitz, they won't. Buck back third down on the 8, in trouble. Got a block behind him, gonna throw and a run, complete to the 25, to the 30, Lindsey's got 35-40, Lindsey's got 45-50, 45-40, run, Lindsey, 25-20, 50, 10, 5, Lindsey stop, Lindsey stop, Lindsey stop.
The first thing I did was look for penalty flags. You know, as a quarterback, you're supposed to do these things. When I noticed there were no yellow flags on the ground, I just sort of followed Lindsey until he crossed the goal line. And at that point, I became a 12-year-old kid again. I laid down on my back on the 50-yard line and just felt the ground shake and just tried to enjoy the moment.
I remember going over the middle, like with a play-action pass, and Buck throwing the ball over, and I'm looking back over my shoulder, and I see Lindsey catch the ball. And all of a sudden, I see Lindsey head toward the end zone, and I see there was one guy with an angle. And Lindsey ran track that, George, and I said he's not going to catch him.
As soon as Scott hit that ground, he turned to the sidelines and started running. And I remember thinking, well, we got more than a first down. And about that time, he's close by me, and I started running with him. In fact, I outran him for the first 10 yards. And then I remember him passing me.
And I just lost my cool completely. I guess he crossed the 50 when I said, run, Lindsey, run, you know, like a big stoop. You know, if you did that in a broadcasting school, they'd blow you out of school or they'd fire you from a job. But I said, run, Lindsey, run, and I think I even counted the yard lines backwards. I may have said 20, 10, 15, 5 or something of this nature at the end. And when he got into the end zone, I didn't say touchdown. I said, Lindsey Scott, Lindsey Scott.
Well, I can't believe it. 92 yards, and Lindsey really got in a foot race. I broke my chair. I came right through a chair, a metal steel chair with about a 5-inch cushion. I broke it. The booth came apart. The stadium fell down. Now they do have to renovate this thing. They'll have to rebuild it now. This is incredible.
It was the most shattering play in all the years I've been in Florida to view.
No way. It was a great play. You know, two guys just making something happen. But again, part of the Georgia-Florida mystique, plays like that.
I had given up. I think all the Georgia people had given up. But Buck Ballou and Lindsey Scott hadn't given up, thank goodness. And of course, we went on and beat Notre Dame to Sugar Bowl for the national championship.
That's what turned this team, that team there, around and made us fight as a team to the end. You know, it was not, we didn't give you a 59-minute football game. We gave you a 60-minute football game every time we stepped up.
The 1981 and 82 games could have been real letdowns for Georgia and Florida, but both teams were flying high, especially the Bulldog offense led by Herschel Walker.
Florida, I think, would think Herschel Walker was Superman. And I doubt if anybody against any other team ever rolled up the yardage that Herschel Walker did against Florida in his 3 efforts down in Jacksonville. His first year in 1980, he rushed for 238 yards as Georgia won. And then in 1981, he rushed for 191 yards and 4 touchdowns. And then in his swan song in 1982, 219 yards, 3 touchdowns as Georgia won 44-0, and Florida was glad he turned pro.
Florida put as much of a beating on him that whole day as I've ever seen a player stand up to. I think a normal person would have been taken off to the hospital by the half, and Herschel was still carrying the ball and running into 4 and 5 Gators all the way to the end.
Herschel Walker excelled in his 3 years against Florida. All-American performances by an All-American back.
It would never fail. Herschel would always come through. When we needed something, Herschel would get it, whether it's catching a swing pass or running up the middle. He was a phenomenal player, and there was no way for them to stop him. So we were confident. I mean, you could bet your house, you could bet your family, you could bet whatever you wanted to, but Herschel would always come through.
The Dogs counted on Herschel to carry the load against Florida. On one drive, he carried the ball 11 times.
You know, I remember people talking about it a lot. You know, how many times that I had a ball on that drive, and if I was tired, and I said, no, that was football. You know, that's football. The ball wasn't heavy. I think that's where that statement came from. Is you know, the ball wasn't that heavy.
He was they say a franchise player. He was definitely a college franchise player. He had tremendous power. Once he got into the hole, nobody was going to stop him. He ran over people. I've seen a lot of backs that really like to run over people. I remember Jimmy Taylor, when he was playing at LSU and later with the Green Bay Packers, would go out of his way to run over people. Herschel didn't really bother to get anybody out of his way. He didn't have to fake anybody out, and he had good speed too.
In all 3 of Walker's years, Georgia played on New Year's Day for the national title. His performances were recognized when in '82 he earned the Heisman Trophy Award. The team split the next 2 years, and in 1985, for the first time in school history, the Gators found themselves ranked in the top spot in the nation for their annual affair with the Georgia Bulldogs.
Florida had played 3 rugged games in a row. They had played VPI, coached by Bill Dooley, Vince's brother, with a knockdown, drag-out game that Florida won by, I think it was 35-17. Then they went over to Auburn to play with the spotlight really on them. If they won, they were probably going to be #1 in the nation. It was another knockdown, drag-out, and Florida came back late in the 4th quarter and scored and won 14-10 and was rated #1 in the nation for 1 week. So now they play Georgia, which was having an ordinary season. I think Georgia wound up about 7-4 that year.
We had never been #1 in the nation, and frankly, we did not handle it very well as a staff, as players. I mean, it was not well handled, and we did not come back down to earth by Saturday.
Despite throwing for a series record 408 yards, Florida quarterback Kerwin Bell had a tough game. Georgia put constant pressure on Bell and the Gator offense. When it was over, you wondered who was #1. Georgia pounded out 344 yards on the ground, including 3 long touchdown runs. Keith Henderson had 2 first-half scores. This one from 76 yards out. Henderson finished with 145 yards on the day. Tim Worley also scored on a long one.
Vince really didn't think he was going to win that year. He was, when he came off the field after the game, he looked over at the sports writers who he'd been saying, and he did like this. Like, I'm as surprised as y'all are.
When it was over, Georgia had come up with one of the biggest upsets in series history, 24-3.
That was a terrific performance on the part of Georgia, and for some reason it just doesn't get its due compared to 76 and maybe even 75, 59 if you want to go all the way back, and of course 1980.
Georgia had now won 7 of the last 8 meetings, and they were a slight favorite to make it 8 of 9 in 1986. With a quick spurt, the Bulldogs jumped to an early 16-3 lead, but Florida fought back. Kerwin Bell found his favorite target, Ricky Nattiel, not once, not twice, but 3 times, and the Gators had a comeback win, 31-19. By now, the game had grown to great heights, not only in Florida and Georgia, but all around the country.
The first year I made a statement, hey, this is like a bowl game going over here, and Coach Spurrier says, no, this is bigger than a bowl game.
I didn't pick it up till the middle 60s, but I remember the first time in the early 70s I saw a breakdown of the money the 2 schools were taking out of the game. It was $400,000 each. And now this is a long time ago, and I realized, holy smokes, this is really like a bowl game. And then I saw the breakdown of the sacks of ice it took, and the soft drinks they sold, and the cups they sold, the setups they were serving. And this was before the stadium grew to 85,000 seats. It became a monster game.
Incredible performances have become the norm. The build-up enormous.
A week of the game, or even 2 weeks before the game, you could start feeling the vibration when people start looking for Georgia-Florida tickets, and you know, they'll just about give you anything you wanted for tickets. And gosh, people were, you know, buying tickets for $300 and $400 one ticket. So we knew right then that it was something big.
Tickets were hard to come by in 1987, a Georgia win. And in 1988, when once again 82,000 jammed the Gator Bowl for what proved to be a one-sided game, the Bulldogs scored the first touchdown of the game on this 22-yard strike to John Thomas. Georgia had the halftime lead for the 4th consecutive year. In the second half, the Bulldogs picked up heaps of yardage via their outstanding ground attack. The top runner, Tim Worley, who led the team with 135 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns. For the 17th time, Vince Dooley had beaten the Gators. But it would be his last. Dooley announced his retirement at the end of 1988. He finished as the all-time winningest coach in the series.
Vince Dooley had a phenomenal record in this game, and he sold the public that Florida had the best players in every game, and then he won over 2/3 of them.
He always did convince the press, and I think he convinced the Florida fans as well that he just had some fine boys that tried so hard with these magnificently talented thoroughbreds that Florida had.
And I went back and checked the records to see during Dooley's years which school did have the most All-SEC, All-American, future NFL players, and Florida did have more. Yet Dooley won 17, lost 7, and tied 1.
He earned respect over the years from the Florida side, from players as well as coaches.
I always had respect for him, and you try to beat those people, but that's what makes them legends, is winning football games. So I would say it was always a challenge to play against a Vince Dooley team.
The Florida boys, at the height of his fame with the Georgia-Florida game, you know, they'd come over after the game. I don't believe they thought they could beat Dooley. They would come over after the game and get his autograph. I mean, he was highly regarded by the Florida team.
With the popular Dooley gone, Georgia hired a former star player to be their coach. Ray Goff was successful in his first year as Georgia beat Florida in 1989 by the final of 17-10. Rodney Hampton outdueled Emmitt Smith in the Battle of Star Backs, scoring twice and rushing for 121 yards. The next year, Florida had the new coach. Steve Spurrier took over the Gator program and was faced with the challenge of changing attitudes.
Steve is a student of Florida football, and in his mind, the Georgia game was the big game on our schedule. It was the barrier that we had to get through. We had to be able to beat the University of Georgia, and he saw no reason why Florida people should believe that there was some kind of jinx or some kind of reason or excuse of why Georgia was dominating the series under Vince Dooley.
I thought it was important to keep the game in Jacksonville. I certainly didn't see any reason why we needed to move the game home and to Athens, which some of the Gator fans had recommended to me. They said, Steve, we can't beat Georgia in Jacksonville. We've been trying for 50 years now. We can't do it. We need to go home and away. At least we can win half of them, maybe. I said, wait a minute. Now. We got a chance to play them in Jacksonville, in the state of Florida, on Florida soil, in a stadium called the Gator Bowl. They have to get on an airplane and come down here. We get on the bus and go over there. And you're trying to tell me that they've got an advantage? I said, I said, we've got the advantage.
The Gators took Spurrier to heart, and in 1990, the Gators destroyed the Bulldogs, taking apart the Georgia squad with an impressive mix of opportunistic defense and pinpoint passing on offense. Shane Matthews had a career day, throwing 3 touchdown strikes, 344 yards. Florida won going away, 38-7. After an easy win in 1991, Florida made it 3 straight in '92. Again, Shane Matthews was the hero, throwing for 2 more scores and finishing his career with a series record 9 touchdown passes. Matthews, truly one of the standout performers in the history of this border war. Mud was a factor in 1993. So was Eric Rhett. Rhett ran a school record 41 times, gained 181 yards, and had the Bulldogs breathing heavy. But it was only after the final play that the game's outcome was determined. The Bulldog pass fell incomplete, and for only the 2nd time in series history, Florida and Steve Spurrier had won 4 straight games against Georgia.
Spurrier now, I really feel, has done more than Dickey or Pell ever did. I think Spurrier has more handicaps stuck on him now, and not just NCAA rules. I think there's more academic handicaps on Spurrier than what Dickey and Pell ever thought of seeing.
They've still got a big series lead on us, and I think that we have destroyed the myth that Florida can't beat Georgia, and that there's the big nightmare of playing them over there. It seemed like for years, especially during the 80s, that it was Georgia's home game.
What does the future hold? Who knows? The Georgia-Florida rivalry is one of the greatest in college football, on a par with any in the country. The memories it's given us will last a lifetime. For the fans, coaches, and players, this is true border war.
I think the natural hate is more so than you have in any other kind of rivalry. Not only because of the quote-unquote neutral side, but it's just because of the history, the tradition, and especially after you experience once. Once you've been there either your freshman or sophomore year, and you come back those last 2 years, you've already got the feel. I mean, it's something special.
It's almost one of those games that if you had a son who was an athlete and was going to play football, you'd like to say, son, I want you to experience this thing, because there's not many guys that will, ever know what that feels like.